Today I have for you this incredible video of these genius kids answering questions about neuroanatomy. I'm a neurologist. I'm going to react to it. I got AI trying to take my job. Now I've got these preteen bioengineered geniuses trying to take my job. Let's take a look.
Ashley, on this diagram of the nerves in the rear of your leg, what nerve just above the foot is missing?
The medial plantar nerve.
Correct. Rodrigo, among the frontal cranial nerves in your brain where a lot of your movement is controlled, what nerve is this located just after the trochlear nerve?
Trigeminal nerve.
Correct. Shivani, in this picture, what are the names of the three nerves found just after the dorsal scapular nerve?
The phrenic nerve, supraclavicular nerve, and axillary nerve.
Correct. Ashley, in this picture of the nerves in your head, which nerve is labeled incorrectly?
The extraoccipital nerve.
Correct. The zygomaticofacial nerve. Rodrigo, the lumbar plexus is a web of nerves in the lower back. Traveling up from there, what are these two nerves above the abductor nerve, which connects to the thigh?
Perineal nerve and sciatic nerve.
Correct. Shivani, traveling from the vertebrae through the brachial plexus, what nerve is shown beneath the nerve to the subclavius?
The long thoracic nerve.
Correct.
So right away I'll react, and you may be wondering, I being a neurologist, could I answer these questions cold? I didn't actually answer them cold. Of course, I saw the responses right away. The video is too fast. But I would say I could probably have answered around half of them. They're very difficult. So it's awesome these kids were actually able to answer these questions. If you think about it, I didn't learn this until I was taking anatomy in medical school. I actually took an anatomy class in college, but we didn't learn that much detail. It was more like systemic anatomy. So not until I was a medical student, perhaps around age 23, did I actually learn any of this. And of course, I've forgotten a lot about it. Only the things that I use on a day-to-day basis am I really able to retain. And of course, it's difficult to identify things in a diagram because it always looks different. And then of course, if you dissect a cadaver, it looks even different. And I remember being in an anatomy lab and you would have one anatomist saying, oh, this is that nerve, and another anatomist would disagree. So it's quite difficult to recognize things on diagrams. So let's take a look at this question by question.
On this diagram of the nerves in the rear of your leg, what nerve just above the foot is missing?
The medial plantar nerve.
So this one is really tough. If it was unlabeled, it would be difficult because a lot of the nerves of the foot aren't necessarily used clinically that often. You know, people with tarsal tunnel syndrome and things like that, they tend to see podiatrists and not neurologists. The way you could answer this question is just understanding an anatomical terminology. Structures that are more medial are closer to the midline. Structures that are more lateral are farther from the midline. And so you can see the lateral plantar nerve named, you would just guess the medial plantar nerve. Maybe that's the way she got this one right.
Correct. Rodrigo, among the frontal cranial nerves in your brain where a lot of your movement...
I love how he looks totally bewildered when the camera's on him, and then he answers the question correctly just immediately.
...is controlled. What nerve is this located just after the trochlear nerve?
Trigeminal nerve.
So it would be almost impossible to answer this unlabeled just looking at the diagram. If you told me this is a picture of the abdomen, I would believe you. It's just too zoomed in. It's a complete mess. The only way you could answer this question is just understanding the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves come off of the brainstem and they're labeled in order from caudal to rostral. And so the fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve, which controls the superior oblique muscle, which controls some movements of the eye. And then a little bit rostral to that, coming off the pons, is the trigeminal nerve, which is mostly a sensory nerve of the face. And so that's sort of the way that Rodrigo was probably able to answer this. Still a tough question.
Correct. Shivani, in this picture, what are the names?
I actually have had a resident who is named Shivani who almost looks like an older version of this girl, possibly. Although perhaps I'm, just remembering that unique name there.
Of the three nerves found just after the dorsal scapular nerve.
The phrenic nerve, supraclavicular nerve, and axillary nerve.
Okay, so this one is really weird. So this is a picture of the brachial plexus, which is a plexus of nerves coming from the cervical spine into the arm. And there are a lot of complexities to it. It's very difficult for medical students to memorize. Even me, a neurologist, I would refer to a diagram if I have a patient who seems to have a brachial plexus injury. I actually have a patient whom I diagnosed with brachial plexus neuritis, inflammation of the brachial plexus, very recently, but I didn't really recognize recognize it because I memorized the entire brachial plexus. It's more like pattern recognition. I could just tell from the history that this distribution of symptoms wouldn't come from a radiculopathy, a pinched nerve in the neck, from a single peripheral named nerve injury. I could just tell it was a brachial plexus injury. And it's really, really difficult to memorize these. And it's kind of rare for someone to have a pure localization of, say, just the upper trunk. I actually think the answers to this question may be incorrect, like the diagram is mislabeled. What's labeled the phrenic nerve, so the dorsal scapular nerve comes off of C5, the very top of the brachial plexus, and then below that is C6, and it looks like the C6 nerve root is labeled the phrenic nerve, but it could be that the phrenic nerve is just coming kind of from above. The phrenic nerve comes from C3, C4, and C5, so it could be kind of crossing over there, but it's very poorly labeled. So what's labeled the supraclavicular nerve, the supraclavicular nerve is above the clavicle. That's actually in the cervical plexus. I believe they're referring to the suprascapular nerve, and it's just mislabeled. The axillary nerve seems to be correct, although at that branch point, the posterior cord, it branches into the axillary nerve and the radial nerve, but it does look like that's the axillary nerve. The fact that she could just name all three, boom, 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 if that's how they were labeled on the diagram that was given to her, is incredible.
Correct. Ashley, in this picture of the nerves in your head, which nerve is labeled incorrectly?
The extraoccipital nerve.
Correct.
Okay, so it has actually labeled extra optical nerve, and she said extra occipital nerve, but she recognized right away that this is a bogus nerve that I haven't learned. And then the commentator mispronounces zygomaticofacial nerve. But, this is actually really tough to identify these nerves, particularly from that angle, but she just kind of recognized, okay, this is obviously a bogus name of a nerve.
So the zygomaticofacial nerve. Rodrigo, the lumbar plexus is a...
I like how the camera picks out the wrong kid there, and he has this look like, I'm competing with these smart kids, huh?
Web of nerves in the lower back. Traveling up from there, what are these two nerves above the obturator nerve, which connects to the thigh?
Perineal nerve and sciatic nerve.
Okay, so the pronunciations are obturator nerve and perineal nerve. It's really hard to see the diagram here. The sciatic nerve is a bigger nerve, easier to identify. Would be very difficult to identify the perineal nerve in that photo if you hadn't recently studied it.
Correct. Shivani, traveling from the vertebrae through the brachial plexus, what nerve is shown beneath the nerve to the subclavius?
The long thoracic nerve.
Okay, this has got to be the hardest one to identify if you look at that label. So the nerve to subclavius comes off of kind of the top of the brachial plexus, like C5, C6, or the upper trunk. And you can see this nerve coming down in a web of nerves. It's almost impossible to see what it is. The long thoracic nerve goes to the serratus anterior, but it's usually kind of labeled more medially, and it's just really, really hard to see it there. Zero chance I would answer that one correctly. Anyways, incredibly impressive overall. I mean, it's likely these kids were given these diagrams to study in advance, and who knows how many different nerves they had to memorize for this competition, but still really, really impressive. Definitely have to watch out for these kids. And I'd be interested to know, to anyone watching this, would you have known the answers to these? I presume if you had some background in anatomy or biology. And let me know if you have suggestions for future videos, if you like videos like this, or you prefer me to stick just to my main topic of multiple sclerosis.